Deaf President Now was an event at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. in March of 1988. From March 6th to March 13th, the students of Gallaudet protested the appointing of a hearing woman as the president of the renowned School for the Deaf. For a week, the students cordoned off the university campus, held marches, rallies, and protests all around Washington, D.C. The DPN movement garnered national attention and changed the public's perception of disabled people. Previously viewed as a fragmented group of medically challenged individuals, after DPN, people began to view the disabled as a minority group who are discriminated against when they are denied access to many public and common services. This changed perspective was critical in gaining support and necessary for the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. Gallaudet University was founded in 1864 by Amos Kendall and Edward Minor Gallaudet. In 1864, during the height of the Civil War, Amos and Kendall presented the bill to Congress. They argued that higher learning was possible for the deaf with sign language. Accepting their proposition, Abraham Lincoln signed a bill allowing Gallaudet University to grant college degrees. In 1988, 124 years after its founding in 1864, there still had never been a deaf president at Gallaudet University, and many felt it was time a deaf president was elected. In 1987, the current president, Jerry C. Lee, announced his resignation as president of the university. The Board of Trustees of the university was responsible for selecting a replacement and narrowed their pool to 3 candidates: Dr. Elizabeth Zinser, a hearing woman, Dr. Harvey Corson, a deaf man, and Dr. I. King Jordan, also a deaf man. The board scheduled their vote for Sunday, March 6th, and from March 1st to March 6th, more than 1,000 students, faculty, and alumni participated in traveling rallies around the university campus, attempting to encourage the board to choose a deaf candidate. On March 6th, the board announced their selection of Elizabeth Zinser as the new president, to much displeasure from the students.
Elizabeth Ann Zinser as the 7th president of Gallaudet.
No!
Because she is a very talented educator.
Zinser was not seen as qualified to run a school for the deaf. She had no knowledge of deaf people and culture and was still learning sign language. Jane Spillman, the chair of the Board of Trustees, met with a few of the students to explain the selection of Zinser, but her dismissive attitude of their concerns and demands strengthened their resolve. At noon of the next day, the protest leaders met with the board members and presented their 4 demands, which were: Zinser must resign and a deaf president must be elected, Jane Spillman must resign from the Board of Trustees, the percentage of deaf members on the Board of Trustees must become at least 51%, and there must be no reprisals against any of the protesters. During that meeting, Spillman supposedly said that deaf people are not able to function in a hearing world, which revealed the disconnect of the board with the deaf community. The board strongly supported Dr. Zinser and resisted pressure from Congress, students, and faculty to replace Zinser with a deaf person. According to Spillman, in choosing Zinser,
a lawful, proper, and final decision was made.
However, the students stood by their demands. They used non-violent, peaceful protests and marches, which allowed local officials, Congressman, and Vice President George H.W. Bush to voice support. They also portrayed themselves as a minority group, similar to blacks and women, as they were oppressed by a hearing-oriented world. This associated them with the well-known civil rights movement, making it likely supporters of that movement would support DPN as well. Soon, DPN rose in prominence in the media, and by day 4 of DPN, Elizabeth Zinser and Greg Hillbook, the student body president, were interviewed by Ted Koppel on ABC's Nightline about the protest.
That they will have to cut off some of the funding to Gallaudet College unless you are withdrawn, and 75% of Gallaudet's funding comes from Congress.
Yes, I understand, and I would find that to be a very unfortunate circumstance, and I'm hoping that the Congress will allow me to take my place as president and provide the opportunity for leadership.
That night, Dr. Elizabeth Zinser announced her resignation. The DPN protest accomplished their goal of attaining a deaf president for Gallaudet University, and also gained national attention and support for their struggle. The students followed in the example of Martin Luther King with entirely peaceful protests, no hostility towards police, no expressions of hatred, boycotting classes and marches. Another reason for the protesters' success was that DPN compared their struggle to those experienced during the civil rights movement. By first drawing that comparison, the deaf, and by association the disabled, were seen as an oppressed group of people. Their struggles were not only discrimination on account of their disability, but also lack of access to many public institutions, which inhibited the ability of disabled persons to fully participate in society. DPN focused on deaf equality with hearing, which eventually evolved to become the equality of disabled persons with able body. In a study titled Paternalism and Protest, the Presentation of Deaf Persons in New York by Beth Haller, according to the study, before DPN, most articles concerning deaf people in the New York Times portrayed deafness as a crippling illness, attributing the problems faced by the disabled individual are due to their disability. However, following DPN, more journalists began to take the progressive view of deaf persons. In this view, the disability of a person results more from the inability of society to adapt to the disabled person's needs than from their particular medical condition. Results such as these confirm the change in perspective of able-bodied people toward disabled persons. DPN led the shift from the mindset that the disabled only needed medical help from their problems to the idea that political and social change is needed for the disabled persons to access their full rights as United States citizens. This shift in perspective was instrumental to the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The purpose of this act was to provide clear instruction on the elimination of the discrimination of disabled persons. The findings of the ADA were that there were 43 million Americans who have physical or mental disabilities, that before the ADA, there was no legal way to address discrimination in areas such as employment, housing, education, and access to public services. Also, these individuals with disabilities were extremely socially, economically, and educationally disadvantaged. The ADA is the most influential disability rights legislation ever passed because of its extremely far-reaching and wide powers. The ADA made it illegal for employers to pass over a person for a job singularly because of their disability. Employers were required to make reasonable accommodations to that person's disability, unless it causes the company undue hardship. All new buildings, bus, and rail lines had to be made wheelchair accessible. Due to popular support, the ADA easily became law in 1990. As President George H.W. Bush signed the bill into law, he said, "I lift up my pen to sign this Americans with Disabilities Act and say, let the shameful walls of exclusion finally come tumbling down." That is the legacy left behind by DPN. The passing of the ADA, called the last great pride of civil rights legislation in the 20th century, gained the momentum it needed due to the press and attention garnered by DPN. DPN used civil rights to put the students' deafness as less important to their fight for equality, and allowed for that change of mindset to apply to all with disabilities. People finally understood that a political movement was necessary for disabled citizens to achieve full rights. It was because of DPN that disabled became a minority group able to inspire support for such a movement. Justin Darr, called the father of the ADA, said, "The long, successful struggle by the students and faculty to replace paternalism with empowerment sent a vital message to the nation, and DPN was a major contributor to the passage of the ADA." DPN led the way for the disability rights movement and paved the way for the passing of the American with Disabilities Act. DPN directed the disability movement in the right direction, proposing the idea that a political movement was needed for equality between disabled and able-bodied.
And with today's signing of the landmark Americans for Disabilities Act, every man, woman, and child with a disability can now pass through once closed doors into a bright new era of equality, independence, and freedom.
The disabled as a minority group is one any American can join at any time. A sudden car crash, terrible accident, or life-threatening disease can turn an able-bodied person into a disabled person at any moment. That's why disability rights matter, because you never know when they may be your own rights.